What happens when you spend 300 years marrying your cousins to keep wealth and power in the family? You get kings who can't close their mouths, queens whose children bleed to death from paper cuts, and emperors so genetically broken they can barely function as human beings. European royalty didn't just rule with iron fists. They ruled with twisted spines, deformed jaws, and blood that wouldn't clot. Their obsession with maintaining pure bloodlines created some of the most disturbing medical conditions in human history. We're talking about genetic catastrophes so devastating they toppled empires and redirected the course of world events. From the Habsburg dynasty's grotesque facial deformities to Queen Victoria's lethal inheritance that spread like wildfire through Europe's royal families, these aren't just medical anomalies. They are the horrifying consequences of treating human genetics like a medieval livestock breeding program. The damage ran so deep that modern scientists are still studying their DNA to understand just how far things can go wrong when you restrict your gene pool to your own family tree. Enter the Habsburg jaw. Meet Charles II of Spain, the final product of the most intensive royal inbreeding experiment ever conducted on a ruling bloodline. After 16 uninterrupted generations of Habsburg cousins marrying each other, Spain's crown had produced something that barely qualified as human. Charles couldn't chew. His lower jaw jutted out so far it rendered his top and bottom teeth unable to meet, forcing him to swallow his food whole like a reptile. Servants were tasked with pre-chewing his meals into a soft paste, yet even then, he choked frequently. The man who ruled the world's largest empire couldn't perform the basic human act of eating. But that was just the visible part. Charles drooled constantly. His tongue was too large for his malformed mouth. He mumbled incoherently, requiring court-appointed interpreters just to communicate with foreign ambassadors. Even his own advisors often had no idea what he was saying during high-stakes meetings. And when it came to sex, things were equally catastrophic. Charles married twice, first to Marie-Louise of Orleans, then to Maria Anna of Neuburg after the first queen died childless. Both marriages were humiliating disasters. Royal doctors documented his complete impotence. Desperate remedies were attempted. Sacred oils, endless prayer sessions, and even employing witches to lift what they believed was a demonic curse. His mind, meanwhile, was arrested at a childlike level. Records from the Spanish court describe a monarch who played with toys during cabinet meetings, threw tantrums if contradicted, and made crucial decisions based on which advisor brought him the most amusing gifts. Foreign envoys described an unsettling man who giggled during solemn negotiations and seemed genuinely perplexed by the formalities of being called Your Majesty. His medical history reveals total bodily collapse. Charles suffered from frequent seizures that left him unconscious and foaming at the mouth. His immune system was so fragile that the common cold nearly killed him multiple times. Chronic diarrhea plagued his life, making public appearances a nightmare for everyone involved and demanding a permanent entourage of servants for cleanup. When Charles finally died in the year 1700 at the age of 38, an autopsy uncovered the full scale of the disaster. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were rotted and blackened. His kidneys were decaying. He had only one testicle, and it was black, shriveled, and useless. His royal physicians concluded it was a miracle he had lived as long as he did. Charles's death set off the War of the Spanish Succession, redrawing Europe's political map for decades. But the true catastrophe was that all of this was entirely preventable. The Habsburgs had deliberately, methodically, and proudly bred all diversity out of their bloodline. Their family tree wasn't a tree anymore. It was a twisted loop, a genetic noose that eventually strangled their dynasty into extinction. And then there was the bleeding crown. Queen Victoria may have looked like a kindly old grandmother, but her blood carried a silent weapon that would wreck European royalty for generations. Hidden deep in her DNA was a mutation for Hemophilia B, a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting. For most people, a paper cut is an inconvenience. For those with hemophilia, it can be a death sentence. And Victoria, as a symptomless female carrier, was the perfect delivery system. She had a 50% chance of passing the disease to each of her sons, who would suffer its deadly effects. Her daughters, meanwhile, had a 50% chance of becoming carriers themselves, silently spreading the gene to their own royal children. With 9 children to marry off, Victoria became a kind of genetic super spreader. She wove her bloodline into almost every major European royal house, unknowingly transforming family alliances into ticking time bombs. Her daughter Alice carried the mutation to Germany. Beatrice transported it to Spain. Another daughter introduced it to Russia. Before long, hemophilia haunted the highest thrones of Europe, undermining monarchies with every weak and bleeding heir. The Russian Empire's downfall was accelerated by the illness of Tsarevich Alexei, great-grandson of Victoria, whose hemophilia led his desperate mother to rely on the Strangely, another of Queen Victoria's daughters carried the mutation straight into the British royal line. At the time, none of the royal families had the faintest idea what was unfolding in their bloodlines. Hemophilia was so rare in the general population that even well-trained doctors had never encountered it. So when royal princes began bleeding uncontrollably from the smallest cuts or bruises, their court physicians were completely baffled. In desperation, they turned to medieval remedies, leeching, bloodletting, poultices, treatments that only made things worse for boys whose bodies couldn't form clots. The bleeding intensified, but the truth was buried. Admitting weakness was not an option for royalty, so a web of carefully constructed lies began to wrap around the afflicted heirs. Official portraits were meticulously staged to obscure bruises, joint swelling, and signs of trauma. Every public appearance was rehearsed like theater. Running, horseback riding, even long walks were quietly removed from their schedules. If a prince died from internal bleeding, the death certificate would list a fever or vague illness. One of the most tragic cases was Prince Leopold, Victoria's own hemophiliac son. He lived under constant threat, every movement shadowed by danger. Records describe a young man confined to a world of cushions and paranoia. He couldn't ride, play sports, or descend a staircase without layers of padding strapped to his body. Every moment of his life was lived in fear of bumping into a table, slipping on a tile, bruising his knee. He was a prisoner in his own royal home, and every person around him was enlisted into his protection detail. The genetic mechanism behind his suffering was particularly insidious. Hemophilia lives on the X chromosome. That means it lurks silently in women and strikes suddenly in their sons. It can skip generations, making families think they've outrun the curse, only to reappear in grandsons and great-grandsons who start bleeding to death over nothing more than a scraped knee. By the early 1920s, the bleeding disease had infiltrated every major royal house in Europe: Britain, Germany, Russia, and Spain. What began as one woman's invisible genetic mutation had exploded into a continent-wide medical emergency. Victoria, who once stood as the matriarch of European monarchy, had unknowingly become its most dangerous genetic weapon. Her children, sent across borders as political chess pieces, became biological Trojan horses, delivering a silent, bleeding disaster into every palace they entered. She didn't mean to destroy the thrones of Europe, but that's exactly what her bloodline did. And nowhere was that destruction more profound than in Russia. In the year 1904, the Russian Empire rejoiced at the birth of a long-awaited male heir Alexei Romanov, the Tsarevich. But jubilation quickly gave way to terror. Within months, the imperial family realized that Alexei had inherited Victoria's curse. His blood didn't clot. Every stumble, every bruise, every playful tumble became a potential death sentence. And this wasn't just a private tragedy, it was a national emergency. The fate of the Russian Empire was now tied to the fragile veins of one small, suffering boy. His bleeding episodes were nothing short of torture. Hemorrhaging in his joints caused his knees and elbows to balloon with trapped blood, warping his limbs into grotesque, swollen knots. The agony was so intense that his screams echoed through the gilded halls of the Alexander Palace, piercing the nerves of everyone who heard them. His parents, Tsar Nicholas and Tsarina Alexandra, watched helplessly as their son writhed in unending pain, sometimes for days. But admitting the truth was unthinkable, so they lied. They staged official photos with military discipline, bruises hidden beneath royal attire, smiles forced beneath pain. His rare public appearances were tightly scripted performances. Servants stood by to catch him if he wobbled. Doctors waited behind curtains with medical kits, prepared for silent emergencies. The heir to the Russian throne was effectively a medical hostage, and every moment he lived risked exposing the secret that could shatter the empire. Into this desperate void stepped Grigory Rasputin, a ragged Siberian mystic with wild eyes and a drunken swagger who claimed to possess divine healing powers. No one could explain how, but when Rasputin was near, Alexei's bleeding slowed. Whether it was hypnosis, stress reduction, or some strange coincidence, he could do what the court physicians couldn't: calm the Tsarevich's blood. Rasputin's influence exploded overnight. This unwashed peasant, once laughed out of salons, was suddenly whispering into the ears of emperors. He gained access to confidential state matters, swayed political appointments, and gradually became an unofficial co-ruler of the Russian Empire, all because he could stop a child from bleeding. But his rise wasn't about prophecy or magic. It was about parental desperation. The Tsar and Tsarina would have done anything to save their son, and Rasputin exploited that with ruthless calculation. His drunken rants, public scandals, and whispered boasts of sexual conquests humiliated the monarchy. He paraded his power shamelessly, flaunting his proximity to the imperial family while manipulating their fears behind closed doors. Meanwhile, the Russian public grew suspicious. Why was this strange man appearing beside the Tsarina in key political decisions? Why was the heir to the throne never seen in public? With the empire unraveling during the catastrophic years of World War I, the people needed strength. Instead, they saw mystery, corruption, and weakness. The truth about Alexei's illness was never shared. The secrecy created fertile ground for conspiracy theories that painted the Romanovs as pawns of a madman and fueled revolutionary anger. The Russian Revolution didn't begin with bread riots or battlefield losses. It began with a boy who couldn't stop bleeding, a mother who turned to a mystic, and a monarchy that wrapped its most dangerous truth in layers of lies. When revolution finally erupted in the year 1917, the people weren't just revolting against autocracy. They were striking at a dynasty they believed had been cursed from within. Tsar Nicholas's abdication came too late. The Bolsheviks weren't interested in exile or reform. They saw the Romanovs not just as political enemies, but as a genetic threat that had to be erased entirely. In July of 1918, in a cellar in Yekaterinburg, Alexei, his mother, father, and 4 sisters were shot, stabbed, and brutally executed. The last heir of Victoria's bloodline bled to death in the dark. The Romanov princesses were executed in a dark basement, their bodies torn by bullets, bayonets, and brutal indifference, bringing an end to more than 300 years of imperial rule in Russia. The final, tragic twist in this saga, Alexei's hemophilia, the inherited curse that triggered their downfall, was entirely manageable by today's medical standards. A simple injection of synthetic clotting factors could have prevented his worst bleeding episodes. Yet, in a world that knew nothing of such science, a rare genetic disorder that affects roughly 1 in every 10,000 males became the catalyst for the collapse of one of the world's largest empires. It didn't have to be this way. But history is full of these grim ironies. Nowhere more so than in the case of King George III of Britain, known to the world as Mad King George. His descent into madness has been the subject of ridicule, rumor, and romanticism. But modern genetic analysis suggests his condition wasn't merely psychological, it was biological. George likely suffered from acute intermittent porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that poisons the body from within. It's not a slow decline, it's an assault. Victims endure waves of searing abdominal pain, muscle failure so extreme they can't lift their arms, and hallucinations that melt the boundary between fantasy and reality. During intense flare-ups, George's urine reportedly turned deep red or purple, a visual symptom so shocking it felt like something out of a horror film, not a royal court. But these weren't just private nightmares. They erupted at moments of political crisis. His first major episode came in the year 1765, just as tensions between Britain and its American colonies were nearing the breaking point. While Parliament debated taxation and representation, their king was screaming nonsense for hours, erupting into rages, and making decisions that his own advisors described as completely unhinged. And it got worse. In 1788, George spiraled so far out of touch with reality that he began conversing with long-dead relatives, believed the streets of London were underwater, and attempted to physically attack his own son. He had to be restrained in a straitjacket, locked away, and subjected to the brutal treatments of the era, ice baths, purges, and blistering agents that offered no relief, only more suffering. The British government teetered on the edge of collapse. Parliament debated declaring the king legally insane and transferring power to his son as Prince Regent. But here's where it gets disturbingly relevant to American history. George's genetic illness may have played a direct role in the loss of the American colonies. Acute porphyria affects judgment and emotional regulation. Victims become paranoid, impulsive, and utterly incapable of compromise. So when colonial leaders like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson came with petitions and diplomatic proposals, they weren't negotiating with a sane monarch. They were facing a man whose brain chemistry had turned against him. His disease didn't just torment him, it warped the course of international diplomacy. The colonies weren't denied their rights by reasoned policy. They were brushed aside by the irrational obstinance of a king too sick to think clearly. And the tragedy deepens. George's condition wasn't random, it was hereditary. Porphyria is passed through genes, and in George's case, almost certainly came from centuries of royal intermarriage. The very system designed to preserve, pure. Royal blood had amplified a rare metabolic disorder until it produced a king who couldn't think straight at the most critical moment in his empire's history. The American Revolution succeeded not only because of the ideals of liberty and self-governance, but also because the king who opposed them was biologically incapable of reason. George's instability continued to plague Britain during the Napoleonic Wars. French intelligence agents reported regularly on the king's outbursts, and Napoleon himself mocked Britain as a crumbling empire ruled by a madman. The uncertainty around George's mental state created years of constitutional crisis. Finally, in the year 1811, with the situation beyond recovery, Parliament invoked the Regency Act and installed his son as Prince Regent. But the horror wasn't over. For nearly a decade more, King George lived in a waking nightmare. Blind, deaf, and trapped in the ruins of his own mind, he spoke to ghosts, relived old battles, and believed himself surrounded by a court that no longer existed. The man who had once ruled the largest empire in history, who had waged war against France, lost America, and resisted revolution, spent his final years alone in Windsor Castle, a monarch in name only. His was not the only mind destroyed by royal blood. Across Europe, the story repeated itself. In Portugal, Queen Maria I became another victim of genetic collapse. Known to history as Mad Maria, she began her reign in the year 1777 as a competent and deeply religious sovereign. But by 1786, she had plunged into such profound psychological ruin that her screams echoed through the corridors of the palace at night. She was no longer ruling, she was surviving. Terrified of divine punishment, she spent days in frantic prayer, refusing food, refusing rest, convinced that God had condemned her soul to eternal damnation. Ministers recorded that she was no longer a person, but a shell filled with dread. Her madness was religious, yes, but it was also clinical, marked by obsessive guilt, auditory hallucinations, and deep paranoia. It wasn't isolated either. Maria's mental deterioration was part of a wider hereditary crisis. The Portuguese royal family, like their European cousins, had intermarried extensively. Madness, depression, and neurological instability coursed through their bloodline. Her son, Prince José, showed signs of crippling depression, violent mood swings, and erratic behavior. The family's genetic legacy wasn't just insanity, it was dynastic decay. In the name of keeping bloodlines pure, they had shattered the very minds meant to hold the crown. And in every palace, from Lisbon to St. Petersburg, from Madrid to London, the story was the same. The obsession with untainted blood had produced kings who couldn't eat, princes who couldn't stop bleeding, queens who screamed through the The madness didn't stop with Queen Maria. Her grandson, King Miguel, became one of the most reviled monarchs in Portuguese history, infamous for his violent temper, erratic behavior, and paranoid delusions. His reign was marked by unpredictability and cruelty. with outbursts so irrational that even his supporters feared what he might do next. His moods swung like a wrecking ball through the fragile structure of Portuguese politics, and his decisions reflected a mind at war with itself. This psychological wreckage wasn't random. It was the direct result of a royal breeding strategy that rivaled even the Habsburgs in intensity. For generations, Portuguese royalty had chosen their spouses from within their own extended family, often marrying into the Spanish crown, where the genetic pool was already dangerously shallow. Instead of diversifying the bloodline, they created a genetic echo chamber, a feedback loop where genes linked to mental illness were recycled, amplified, and passed on like a deadly inheritance. Queen Maria's mental state, already delicate, disintegrated completely after a series of personal and political traumas. The execution of her nephew, King Louis XVI of France, during the French Revolution, sent her into a psychological tailspin from which she never recovered. She became obsessed with the idea that all royalty was cursed, that divine punishment was imminent, and that her own family would be next. Her paranoia deepened, her religious mania consumed her, and her grip on reality slipped away entirely. Maria's court transformed into a surreal, dysfunctional shell of a government. She refused to sign state documents, believing they were traps set by demons to condemn her soul. She disrupted meetings with sudden shrieks and religious tirades, convinced she was already damned and that her advisors were specters sent to deceive her. Foreign ambassadors wrote home describing a kingdom ruled by a ghost, a queen who wandered the palace halls muttering prayers, weeping uncontrollably, and declaring her own spiritual death. By the year 1799, the situation had deteriorated to the point that Maria was officially declared mentally unfit to rule. Her son João was installed as Prince Regent. But by then, the damage to Portugal's government and its international standing had been done. The royal court, paralyzed by Maria's delusions and Miguel's instability, failed to respond effectively to the pressures of the Napoleonic Wars. Worse, the royal family's obvious and escalating genetic dysfunction shattered their legitimacy in the eyes of the world. Portugal's inability to manage its own affairs led directly to the loss of Brazil, the jewel of its colonial empire, cementing a decline that had begun not on the battlefield, but in the palace nursery. The collapse of the Portuguese royal psyche revealed something that the Habsburg jaw and the Romanov blood disorder could not. Genetic isolation doesn't just warp the body, it can annihilate the mind. While Charles of Spain choked on his tongue and Alexei of Russia bled from his joints, the House of Braganza screamed into the night, lost in delusion and spiritual dread. Their madness was no less lethal. It destroyed policy, undermined alliances, and left their nation vulnerable at the most critical moments in its history. And it all stemmed from the same misguided obsession, the same fatal lie that had haunted Europe's palaces for centuries. The belief that royal blood must remain pure. That age of royal genetic catastrophe finally began to end. Not because of some sudden wave of scientific enlightenment or noble self-reflection, but because there was simply no choice. By the early 20th century, after watching hemophilia, insanity, and physical deformities wipe out entire dynasties, European royalty slowly abandoned their cult-like reverence for bloodline purity. Marriages to commoners, once unthinkable, became a quiet strategy for survival. They weren't motivated by